You're 35,000 feet in the air. Beneath you is nothing but ocean stretching in every direction. The flight attendant just reminded everyone, for the third time, that smoking is strictly prohibited on board. There are warning signs plastered on every wall. The penalties for lighting up are severe. And yet, if you get up right now, walk to the back of the plane, and step into that tiny bathroom, you'll find something that absolutely should not exist on a modern aircraft. A metal ashtray, built right into the door, not a leftover from a renovation, not an oversight, not something the airline forgot to remove. It's there on purpose. It's required by law, and if it goes missing, that plane doesn't leave the ground. That sounds insane, right? We banned smoking on planes decades ago. Flight attendants will confront you immediately if they smell cigarette smoke. You can face fines that run into the thousands of dollars, and in some countries, criminal charges. So why on earth is there a designated place to put out a cigarette in the very same bathroom where smoking is forbidden? The answer involves a near disaster that almost nobody talks about, a piece of aviation philosophy that quietly saves lives, and a paradox so elegant that once you understand it, you'll never look at that little metal box the same way again. But to understand why it's still there, we have to go back to when it was actually meant to be used. Picture a commercial flight in the mid-1960s. The cabin is thick with cigarette smoke almost from the moment the aircraft takes off. Ashtrays are embedded into every armrest. Those small, satisfying chrome bowls with the flip-open lid that make a sharp little click when you shut them. Flight attendants in perfectly tailored uniforms move through the aisle distributing not just drinks, but complimentary cigarette packs, each one printed with the airline's logo. First-class passengers receive engraved cigarette cases as gifts. The whole experience is designed to feel luxurious, effortless, and free. On the longer transoceanic routes, the Boeing 707s and Douglas DC-8s that were the giants of that era, some aircraft had dedicated smoking lounges, not just a section, an actual lounge area separated from the rest of the cabin by curtains, where passengers gathered to smoke, drink, and socialize at 30,000 feet like they were at a cocktail party suspended in the sky. Airlines actively partnered with tobacco companies. There were advertisements in in-flight magazines showing elegantly dressed passengers exhaling smoke with serene expressions, the implication being that flying and smoking were both sophisticated pleasures that naturally belonged together. Nobody thought much about it. This was simply how air travel worked. The first serious cracks in that picture didn't come from passengers. They came from the flight attendants, or stewardesses as they were still called then. They were the ones spending 8, 10, 12 hours inside that smoke-filled aluminum tube, inhaling secondhand smoke with every breath for entire careers. Medical reports began surfacing, showing elevated rates of respiratory illness among cabin crew. Then came the passenger complaints. People with asthma who emerged from flights barely able to breathe. People who boarded with clean clothes and stepped off smelling like they'd been sitting in a bar all night. Airlines resisted fiercely. They commissioned their own studies trying to prove the ventilation systems were handling the smoke adequately. They argued that their smoking customers represented too large a portion of the market to alienate. They lobbied regulators. They stalled. And then came the fires. In 1973, a Varig Airlines Boeing 707 was on a flight from Rio de Janeiro to Paris when smoke began filling the cabin from somewhere in the rear of the aircraft. The source was a fire in the aftee lavatory, almost certainly caused by a carelessly discarded cigarette that had been thrown into a trash container. The pilots made an emergency descent and managed to land the plane, but the smoke was so dense and so fast-moving that the evacuation couldn't happen quickly enough. Of the 134 people on board, 123 died, not from the crash, but from smoke inhalation while the aircraft was still on the ground. 123 people, because of a cigarette that didn't have anywhere safe to go. The aviation world noted it. Regulators noted it. But the smoking culture was so entrenched, so normalized, that change came slowly. Then, in 1988, the United States took the first major step, banning smoking on domestic flights under 2 hours. By the mid-1990s, that had expanded to all domestic flights, regardless of duration. By the end of the decade, international airlines were following suit. By the early 2000s, the ban was effectively universal across commercial aviation. You can't smoke on a plane, full stop. Any plane, any airline, any route, anywhere in the world. The era of in-flight ashtrays was officially over, except it wasn't, not entirely. Because while the cigarettes disappeared from the cabins and the armrest ashtrays were quietly removed, one very specific ashtray remained. The one in the lavatory door. And the reason it stayed, the reason it had to stay, comes down to a particular kind of wisdom that aviation learned the hard way over decades of tragedy. Here's the thing about rules. They work on people who follow them. The vast majority of passengers today would never dream of lighting a cigarette on a plane. They know the rule. They respect it. They'd never put hundreds of other people's lives at risk for a nicotine fix. But the aviation industry doesn't design its safety systems around the vast majority. It designs them around the outlier, the one person on 1,000 flights, or 10,000 flights, who decides that the rules don't apply to them, and that person exists. They've always existed. Smoking violations on commercial aircraft are more common than most people realize. Flight attendants report catching passengers mid-cigarette in lavatories more frequently than you'd expect, considering the penalties involved. People sneak e-cigarettes. People assume that just this once, just for a few minutes, they won't get caught. And sometimes, not often, but sometimes, they manage to smoke the entire cigarette before the smoke detector catches them or a flight attendant knocks on the door. And when they're done, they need to put it out somewhere. This is where the ashtray earns its existence, because if there is no ashtray, that half-finished cigarette has to go somewhere. And where it goes is the trash bin. The trash bin full of paper towels, tissue paper, and other highly flammable material. The trash bin that is now sealed inside a small enclosed space, tens of thousands of feet in the air, far from the nearest fire station, with limited firefighting resources on board, and nowhere to land for potentially hours. Aviation regulators examined this scenario carefully after a series of lavatory fire incidents in the late 1970s and early 1980s. The pattern was unmistakable. Fires in aircraft bathrooms weren't primarily happening because someone was smoking. They were happening because someone was smoking and then had no safe way to extinguish the cigarette. Remove the ashtray to discourage smoking. And you don't stop people from smoking. You just stop them from safely disposing of what they've smoked. The International Civil Aviation Organization and the FAA reached the same conclusion. The ashtray stays. Not because smoking is tolerated, but because reality is what it is, and the consequences of being caught without one are catastrophic. So in the Master Minimum Equipment List, the document that specifies every piece of equipment a commercial aircraft must have functioning before it can legally take off, there's a line item for the lavatory ashtray. If it's missing, broken, or damaged, the aircraft is grounded, not delayed, grounded, until the issue is resolved. This applies to a brand new Boeing 787 Dreamliner just as much as it applied to a 1970s 727. The rule doesn't care how modern the aircraft is. It doesn't care that the aircraft has advanced smoke detection systems and fire suppression equipment. The ashtray is required. It gets inspected alongside the oxygen masks and emergency slides. It is, by the formal definitions of aviation regulation, a safety-critical piece of equipment. To fully appreciate why aviation takes this so seriously, you need to understand what a fire on an aircraft actually means. On the ground, a fire is terrifying but manageable. You evacuate. Fire trucks arrive within minutes. People escape into open air. The building burns, and that's a tragedy. But the fire itself has limits. It can be fought, contained, and eventually extinguished by resources that can reach it. At 35,000 feet, none of those options exist. The aircraft is traveling at roughly 500 miles per hour through air that is 60 degrees below zero and contains barely enough oxygen to breathe. The nearest airport could be an hour away. The entire aircraft, passengers, crew, cargo, is contained inside a pressurized aluminum tube. If fire takes hold in that environment and isn't controlled quickly, the outcomes become catastrophic with frightening speed. Aviation researchers and accident investigators generally agree that crews facing an in-flight fire have somewhere between 15 and 20 minutes to identify, reach, and begin actively fighting that fire before control starts slipping away from them. This is not a comfortable margin. It's a terrifyingly narrow window within which everything needs to go right. The deadliest possible scenario is a hidden fire, one that starts in a wall, inside a panel, beneath a floor, somewhere that the smoke and heat are masked from both crew and sensors long enough for the fire to establish itself. This is not a theoretical concern. It killed everyone aboard Swissair Flight 111. In September 1998, a Swissair MD-11 departed New York's JFK Airport bound for Geneva with 229 people on board. Roughly 53 minutes into the flight, the crew noticed an unusual smell in the cockpit, something described as an odor like something burning. They issued a PAN call, which is a step below a full emergency declaration, and began preparing to divert to Halifax, Nova Scotia. Minutes later, they upgraded to a full mayday as smoke began entering the cockpit. They were given immediate clearance to land at Halifax, just 30 miles away. They never made it. The fire, which had started in the aircraft's in-flight entertainment wiring above the cockpit ceiling, spread invisibly through the aircraft's insulation. By the time anyone on board fully understood what was happening, the systems that might have allowed them to land safely were failing. The aircraft struck the ocean 8 miles short of the airport. All 229 people died. The Swissair investigation took years and produced findings that reshaped aviation safety regulations around the world. But one of its most haunting conclusions was how fast a hidden fire can overwhelm an aircraft. The crew had been professional, competent, and experienced. They had done nearly everything right. The fire still won. That's what fire means at altitude. And that's the context in which you have to understand why aviation regulators look at a lavatory ashtray and say, that is a safety critical item. Now let's talk about how that little ashtray actually works, because the modern version is significantly more sophisticated than it might appear. The ashtray you'll find on a current commercial aircraft isn't just a metal bowl, it's an engineered device designed around a specific failure mode. The cigarette that isn't fully extinguished before it's placed inside. The interior of the ashtray is designed to deprive that cigarette of sufficient oxygen to continue burning. Close the lid, and any remaining ember typically goes out within seconds. It's a passive fire suppression device built directly into the most likely location where the problem would arise. The material itself is non-negotiable. Aviation ashtrays are constructed from stainless steel rated to withstand direct flame contact without deforming, melting, or releasing toxic fumes. The mounting is tamper-resistant. You can't pull it off the door without specialized tools, which prevents both vandalism and the kind of accidental removal that might happen during maintenance. The design ergonomics have been refined over decades to ensure that even a panicked, fumbling person can open the ashtray with one hand in low visibility. Because if someone has lit a cigarette in an aircraft lavatory and suddenly realizes that a flight attendant is about to knock on the door, their next move needs to be intuitive and fast. And here's something worth sitting with. The people who designed these specifications weren't trying to make it convenient to smoke. They were trying to make sure that if someone smokes anyway, the ending of that story is boring. Someone gets caught, gets fined, and the plane lands safely, rather than the alternative. The ashtray exists within a larger layered safety system. The lavatory also has smoke detectors that are among the most sensitive on the aircraft. There's an automatic fire suppression system built into the waste paper compartment. If something catches fire in the trash bin, a fixed extinguisher activates automatically. There's a fire extinguisher in the lavatory itself that the crew can access. The walls and ceiling of the lavatory are made of fire-resistant materials with specific ignition thresholds. The door seals are designed to limit the spread of smoke into the cabin. Every single one of these systems is a layer, and the ashtray is a layer. Aviation doesn't trust any single system to be perfect, because experience has demonstrated, repeatedly and fatally, that any single system can fail. A smoke detector can malfunction. The automatic extinguisher can be triggered prematurely or not at all. The fire-resistant wall panels can still burn if exposed to enough heat for long enough. But an ashtray, a simple, properly constructed metal box with a hinged lid, is as close to fail-proof as any safety device gets. It doesn't have sensors that can degrade. It doesn't require electrical power. It doesn't have software that can freeze. It simply exists in the right place, waiting to be useful. There's a specific kind of thinking embedded in all of this that's worth understanding, because it's what separates aviation from almost every other industry when it comes to safety. Most industries manage risk by probability. They ask, what's the likelihood this will happen? If the likelihood is low enough, the risk is considered acceptable and no additional measure is taken. This is rational in many contexts. Insurance companies operate this way. Building codes are written this way. Road safety standards are written this way. Aviation operates differently. In aviation, the question isn't just how likely is this, it's what happens if it does occur. A risk that is extraordinarily unlikely but catastrophic if it materializes gets treated with the same seriousness as a risk that is relatively common but minor. The consequences drive the response, not just the probabilities. This philosophy has a name in aviation circles, defense in depth, or sometimes referred to as layered safety. Every critical system is backed up by at least one other system. Every critical process is checked by at least one other person. Every scenario that could result in a catastrophic outcome, no matter how remote, gets a safeguard. This is why aircraft have two engines, and why two-engine aircraft are still designed to fly safely on one. It's why autopilot systems have multiple independent control loops, so that a failure in one doesn't cascade through the others. It's why pilots go through simulator training for emergency scenarios so rare that they may never encounter them in an entire career. Because if they do encounter them, they need to have already responded to them. It's why cockpit doors have a specific kind of handle designed so that someone can exit even if the door is jammed. It's why every emergency slide is tested to deploy within 10 seconds. Even though the scenario where you need to evacuate an aircraft on a runway in under 90 seconds is statistically extraordinarily unlikely for any individual aircraft. And it's why the ashtray stays in the lavatory door of a plane that hasn't permitted smoking for 25 years. Because when someone imagines removing it, the conversation in the aviation safety world goes like this. The probability that someone will smoke on this flight is very low. The probability that they'll then discard the cigarette unsafely is even lower. The probability that this causes a significant fire is lower still. So why keep the ashtray? And the aviation answer is because we've seen what happens when that chain of low probability events completes itself. We've read the accident reports, we've seen the photographs, we've heard the recordings from cockpit voice recorders, and we've decided that no fire on a commercial aircraft should ever be traceable back to a decision we made to remove a device that cost almost nothing. That's the philosophy. That's why the ashtray is there, not because aviation expects you to use it, because aviation takes seriously the version of events in which you do. You might be wondering whether there are people who think the whole thing has become outdated, a relic that belongs more to a museum than to a modern aircraft. The argument isn't unreasonable on its face. Detection technology has improved dramatically. The cultural attitudes towards smoking have shifted so profoundly that someone lighting a cigarette on an aircraft is genuinely almost unthinkable to most passengers. The fines are severe. The enforcement is real. But here's where it gets interesting. Regulators have actually considered removing the requirement. Airlines have lobbied for it. The argument for removal cites exactly those factors: improved detection, cultural shift, modern enforcement, weight savings across a fleet, the minor but real economic benefit of simplifying lavatory door manufacturing at scale. Every time, the regulators have said no. Part of that no is institutional conservatism, and that's worth acknowledging honestly. Aviation regulatory bodies don't change rules quickly, and they tend to err heavily on the side of caution when it comes to removing safety measures. There's a legitimate critique that some of this conservatism isn't purely about safety. It's about not wanting to be the administrator who approved the removal of a device and then had it show up in an accident report 5 years later. But the more substantive part of the no is this: the scenarios in which the ashtray matters are precisely the scenarios that are hardest to prevent through enforcement alone. You can tell a determined person not to smoke. You can have smoke detectors in the lavatory ceiling. You can have flight attendants watching for people spending too long in the bathroom. And that determined person will still sometimes smoke. The question isn't whether you can prevent all smoking. The question is what happens after the cigarette is done. And that question, the ashtray answers. There's a final dimension to this that doesn't get discussed often enough, and it's perhaps the most human part of the whole story. Aviation safety isn't just a set of technical standards. It's a culture, and culture is built on stories, on the specific, human, devastating stories of what happened when something went wrong and why. Every regulation in aviation can be traced back to an accident. That's a sobering thought on one level. It means the rulebook is, in a sense, a record of catastrophes. But on another level, it's a remarkable thing. Those catastrophes were studied, documented, analyzed, and translated into preventive measures so that the same combination of factors would never again produce the same outcome. The ashtray is connected to those stories, to the Varig fire and its 123 victims, to smaller incidents that never made the news but showed up in confidential safety reports and incident databases that regulators review, to the near disasters, the flights that landed safely with scorched trash bins and shaken crews, the fires that were caught in time by 30 seconds by a single smoke detector that happened to be working correctly that day. Every one of those incidents is an argument for the small metal box on the lavatory door, not because the people who were hurt or killed were careless, but because they encountered a chain of events that a simple passive device could have interrupted, and that device wasn't there. So now it is. On every commercial aircraft, on every flight, in every lavatory, sitting at eye level on the door, clearly marked, easy to open with one hand. Not because you're expected to use it, but because someone, somewhere, might need to. And aviation decided a long time ago that when that moment comes, it should be ready. The next time you board a flight, whether it's a short hop between nearby cities or a 14-hour transoceanic crossing, and you slip into that tiny lavatory with its folding door and its soap dispenser that never seems to have soap, and its mirror that makes everyone look slightly unwell, take a second to look at the door. There's a little rectangular metal plate with a hinged cover, usually positioned at about chest height, with the word ashtray embossed on it or printed above it. It's been there since before you were born, probably, or at least since before the smoking ban. It's survived every upgrade cycle, every redesign, every weight reduction program that the manufacturers put the aircraft through. It survived because the people responsible for keeping flights safe decided that it was worth more than the few grams it weighs and the few cents it costs. It's one of the simplest devices on the aircraft. No software, no sensors, no moving parts beyond the hinge. Just metal, shaped and mounted in the right place, doing its job by existing. That's what thoughtful safety engineering looks like. Not the dramatic, expensive, technologically impressive systems, though those matter too, but the quiet, simple, easy-to-overlook backup that's ready for the moment when everything else has already failed to prevent a problem. The ashtray in the airplane bathroom isn't a contradiction. It isn't a relic. It isn't evidence that aviation is confused about its own rules. It's evidence of the most important thing aviation has learned from a century of tragedy. And innovation. That the rules are written for the people who follow them, but the safety systems are designed for the ones who don't. And if you want to keep everyone on board alive, you'd better be ready for both.